My favorite soap opera is the first century of evolutionary biology. My favorite character is Charles Darwin. Today is his 215th birthday, and by the end of this video, he will be your favorite character also. Darwin was not an especially promising student as a child, and his first sign of scientific promise was the makeshift chemistry lab that he and his older brother set up in their garden shed, which it sounds like they mostly used to make explosions. He liked hanging out with dogs and horses, which he was pretty good at. He liked singing, which he was terrible at, and he was single-mindedly obsessed with insects. At one point as a teenager, he wrote a letter to one of his best friends which begins with the absolutely iconic line, "I am dying by inches from not having anybody to talk to about insects." The rest of the letter is 2 paragraphs of info dumping about insects, a cursory "by the way, how are you doing?" and then more info dumping about insects. One is not supposed to retroactively diagnose historical figures, but I do find it pertinent to mention that he went on to write a more than 300-page book about facial expressions. His dad was a medical doctor and wanted him to also be a medical doctor, so sent him to medical school at Edinburgh, and Charles got most of the way through this degree program and then abruptly dropped out, probably because anesthetic hadn't been invented yet and the thought of doing surgery terrified him. Then he went to Cambridge to study theology with a view to becoming a parson, which was also a dad-approved respectable career, and proceeded to be a thoroughly mediocre student who mostly screwed around playing sports, but he did graduate this time, degree in hand, age 22, dad's ready to breathe a sigh of relief, finally got my directionless, chaotic son settled down, and then he got a letter from one of his professors saying, "Hey, so there's this Navy officer who's looking for a friend." The guy's name is Robert Fitzroy, he's only 26, master and commander of a small ship named Beagle that's about to go on a map-making mission, and Fitzroy is looking for a civilian gentleman to bring with him as a passenger to keep him company. Are you interested? Darwin's dad was not happy about this, and neither, it turned out, was Robert Fitzroy, who immediately tried to pull the plug on the whole thing. So while Fitzroy's boss and Darwin's professor were trying to get them in touch, Fitzroy wrote a letter to Darwin saying, "I'm so sorry for wasting your time, I actually already picked someone for this position, my totally real friend Mr. Chester, who definitely exists, please don't come." Darwin got the letter, ignored it, went to London anyway to meet Fitzroy, and then Fitzroy took one look at Darwin and said, "Haha, the craziest thing just happened. I actually just got a letter from Mr. Chester, my real friend who exists. He can't come. Are you still interested?" And then they proceeded to be completely unhinged about each other. Over the course of that week, Darwin turned around and wrote his sister 3 different letters gushing about this guy, as well as a few to the professor. Including lines such as, "Captain Fitzroy is everything that is delightful. If I was to praise half so much as I feel inclined, you would say it was absurd. Perhaps you thought I admired my beau ideal of a captain in my former letters. All that is quite a joke to what I now feel. Not that I suppose it is likely that such violent admiration as I feel for him can possibly last." Fitzroy didn't have a lot of friends, as evidenced by the fact that he needed a Navy-issue best friend. Most of the unhinged shit that he wrote about Darwin was to Darwin, including the absolute banger of a letter that I can summarize as, "Hey, I'm sorry I didn't reply to your previous letter more promptly. Your previous letter began with a slightly apologetic tone. I assumed you were going to say you were no longer coming. I further assumed that that was because you had a girlfriend. That made me really upset, so I threw your letter away. I have since read your letter. I realize I misunderstood. When can we have dinner together?" Fitzroy introduced Darwin to his first officer, a Lieutenant John Wickham, who immediately complained about how tall Darwin was, which is how I found out that Darwin was goofy, silly tall. And that sounds like a weird complaint, but he was absolutely correct to do this because you really were not supposed to be 6'4" on an 1820s brig sloop. Darwin did not comfortably fit in the cabin he was supposed to be sleeping in, and in order to hang a hammock for him, they had to remove a drawer from a chest of drawers so that his feet could go there. I think that is part, but not all, of the reason why he sometimes slept in the captain's cabin instead. Speaking of hammocks, how do you think you're supposed to get into a hammock? Even if you had never got into a hammock before, do you think you would try stepping into it feet first from a standing position? Because that's what Darwin tried, and we know this because he wrote a journal entry immediately afterward that's like, "Yeah, so I'm on the floor." At one point during the Atlantic crossing, they managed to catch a Portuguese man of war. Darwin touched it and then put his finger in his mouth, and then was unable to express what had gone wrong because he had temporarily lost the use of his tongue. Ironically, the guy who discovered natural selection came very, very close to being naturally deselected multiple times on the voyage of the Beagle. Then they made it to Brazil, Darwin went adventuring and immediately lost his passport, because of course he did, at which point he was stopped by the police and questioned because they assumed he was riding a stolen horse. He couldn't prove his identity because passport, and he had to be rescued by officers from the Beagle. Darwin was close with his older sisters Caroline and Susan, and in order to keep them updated on what he was getting up to on the voyage of the Beagle, he sent them not just letters but also his old journals once he was done with them. And what I think happened is Caroline and Susan realized that their younger brother was secretly intelligent and the world's worst self-promoter, because what they did was they started circulating his writings in intellectual circles back in England, and so less than a year before the end of this 5-year voyage, Charles gets a letter from Caroline that's like, by the way, you should probably know that you're a famous travel writer now. So those of us who care about the scientific career of Charles Darwin really owe a lot to Caroline and Susan, because thanks to their promotion, he was able to spend the rest of his career in conversation with other scientists who already respected him and were willing to believe in him, which is great because he didn't always believe in himself. As an older man, he wrote in a letter at one point the line, "I hate myself, I hate clover, and I hate bees." In a different letter, "I am very poorly today and very stupid and hate everybody and everything. One lives only to make blunders." Happy 215th birthday to a surprisingly relatable legend who definitely did blunder sometimes, but in the process also brought us some of the greatest scientific writing of all time.